Thank you to everyone for tuning into the event. I would describe 19V, which I'll talk about in a minute, as a new initiative that's aimed to bring together scholars of 19th century Russia in different disciplines and from around the world. And I want to start by thanking the Jordan Center, which has been incredibly supportive of the initiative and very generous in sharing its resources. So thank you, Josh, and thank you, Sasha, for all your work in putting this together. So I'm speaking to you from New York City, where we are, it seems, simultaneously locked down and in the midst of some really stunning social upheaval. So for several days now, 24/7, there have been police helicopters over my head and tens of thousands of protesters streaming past my kitchen windows. It's impossible to remain unaware that life is changing radically before our eyes. And in this context, I fully understand that resources of all kinds, time, money, health, are severely constrained for many of us around the globe. So it's really our hope that this collective can help us sustain a sense of intellectual possibility and hope, and opening out into the larger world in this unprecedented moment. So given this unprecedented moment, why the 19th century and why this initiative that we're calling 19V? As I've outlined in communications with many of you, again, our hope is to provide a way to start conversations. It's not at all uncommon for those of us who work in institutions outside of Russia to be the only person around whose focus is Russia in the 19th century. So the first thing I hope that 19V can do is mitigate a sense of isolation that I think many of us, again, particularly outside of Russia, often feel. Another goal, an intellectual goal, would be to reflect on the 19th century itself as a crucial construct. So as the cultural production of this era grows more and more distant from our own moment, it's like I'm watching in real time as the 18th century, as the 19th century becomes the new 18th century, right? To my students, the 19th century might as well be the Spanish Golden Age. That's how far away it is to them. So as the cultural production of this era kind of recedes from us, we certainly encounter framing challenges, but we also encounter intellectual opportunities. And it's a moment when we can think about what 19th century culture means to us today. As I wrote in a blog post talking about this initiative a few months ago, centuries are, of course, imaginary entities that we use to manage the flux of time. And recently, for historians of Russia and Europe, that is, until 1989 and 1991, the 19th century served as what you could call the origin story of the present. And I'm stealing that from an ACES roundtable that was called What Was and When Was Russia's 19th Century. But that has changed in our time. In recent years, the era's relationship to our own time has become less obvious. New scholarship in European and world history has taken advantage of this new distance to ask large, synthesizing questions. And historians of Russia, too, are starting to ask large questions that come out of this distance. So what I hope that we're able to do through is something similar, but with a focus more on cultural production. That is, I want to reflect not just on the periods of boundaries, that what makes the 19th century a period anyway, also on its overall significance and its relationship to our world today. And as a not insignificant side question, how do we interest students in 19th century culture at a time when the present moment's concerns are more urgent than ever? In other words, and this speaks, I think, to far larger questions in the academy, how do we work to counter the presentism that threatens to distort our understanding of culture, of art, of their place in our world? So that's the why of 19V. And now I want to talk a little bit about the what, about what it is we're doing. And I want to emphasize from the beginning, is everybody. This is a horizontal organization, and what we're trying to do is bring people together so we can figure out what we want to do. So I'll give you a quick rundown of the ideas that are being worked on so far. At this point, we have 4 main initiatives in the works, all organized and run by different members of the group and in response to a range of interests. So first of all, as most of you probably already know, the Jordan Center blog, which is called All the Russias, is hosting an occasional series of posts on 19th century studies. And Ani Kokobobo, who's here or will soon be here, she's taken the lead in organizing the blog series. And she kicked off the initiative in April with a piece called On Not Talking About Gender in 19th Century Russian Literature. And in the fall, the blog posts will be coming up again. I'm just going to give you a few examples of the pieces that we have lined up. Thomas Roberts is going to talk about weird realisms. Kirill Zubkov and Alexei Vdovin in Russia will each post on the relationship between non-Russian and Russian scholarly approaches to literature. Margaret Samu will talk about what it's like to work on 19th century Russian visual culture outside of Russia. Greta Matzner-Gore and Sarah Dickinson will contribute reflections on the issue of minorness in a century full of exceedingly major writers. So that is far from a complete list of the blog posts that we have lined up, but I hope it gives you an idea of the range of interests that are encompassed in the group. And of course, we want to hear from other people who might be interested in writing for the blog or who would like to respond to any of the posts. So that was the first initiative. The second, that's just now getting underway, is some members of our collective are organizing a series of virtual talks. Sarah Dickinson, who's in Genoa, Italy, has started scheduling speakers for a 19th seminar speaker series. So beginning on June 17th and continuing every other Wednesday or so through the end of 2020 and beyond, we'll be providing a venue for people to speak in a less than formal way about their current research. So the idea, it would be to talk about what you're working on right now, but always with an eye to its relationship to how your work fits into larger issues in the field. So we think it would encourage exchange if people were to speak fairly briefly, meaning this is not a formal conference presentation. And perhaps each talk or those talks that want it, people who want it, could be followed by a kind of собеседник or an interlocutor who would help to bring out the larger themes in the work and in the discussion. But I would emphasize that the format of the series is really flexible. So in August, for example, 2 speakers will be presenting together. Valeria Sobel and Katya Bowers will speak together about new scholarship on the Gothic in Russia and how this work might change how we think about the 19th century. So as you see, small groups on a given theme are entirely possible. So for instance, our first session, which will be on June 17th, Sarah's planning a roundtable on the question of periodization, broadly construed. So what was the 19th century? And in fact, for this date, we may still be looking for roundtable participants. So if you're interested in talking or thinking about how periodization works in your field or your subfield, please get in touch. And again, like a variety of disciplines would be a great thing. Sarah Dickinson's email address, there's Sarah, is on our list, meaning the Google Doc that I've circulated, and I hope you've all written your name on it. But maybe Sarah would also be willing to put her contact information in the chat here. And if so, if there's somebody who'd like to help kick off this virtual lecture series in June, you can get in touch with Sarah. And I want to emphasize again that both the blog posts and the lecture series are trying to encourage conversation across disciplines. We hope to hear from scholars working on 19th century Russian culture in all fields. So, you know, not only art history and literature, but theater, dance, music, material culture, the history of culture, and so on. And please do get in touch if you're interested in participating. The third initiative I want to mention briefly is being organized by one of our collaborators, Ornella Di Speciati at the University of Bergamo in Italy. And Ornella is announcing that the eminent Italian publishing house, Le Edizioni, will be bringing out Ruska Biblioteca. So this is a series of critical studies of 19th century authors and issues, and new translations of lesser known texts, all accompanied by introductions and critical apparatuses. So it's under Ornella Dispecciati's direction, and I'm sure Ornella is here, but I can't see her on my screen. And other members of our collective are also involved. Sarah Dickinson, Ugo Persi of the University of Bergamo, Laura Rossi, Milan, Lena Steiner, University of Bonn, Eirik Sivdovin at Higher School of Economics, and myself. So as you can see, Ruska Biblioteca will draw on the expertise and creativity of Russia-focused scholars from all around the world. And we are looking forward to receiving book proposals. So finally, before I close, I'll mention a reading group that's being organized by Helen Stuhr-Rommereim. Helen also was on my screen, and I'm sure she's somewhere, but this is called The Other 19V. The Other 19V, which Helen will describe more fully in a moment, is devoted to reading and discussing lesser known texts and writers. And by lesser known, I mean those that are less often the focus of our attention in Russian studies outside of Russia. So Helen will be talking about that in a minute. And I'll close by saying that these are just a few examples of the kinds of initiatives we hope will be encouraged by and within the larger umbrella of 19V. The group is markedly informal. At this point, it exists mostly as a Google document and as all of us here. For the time being, we hope to minimize bureaucratic structures and hierarchies and see what evolves. And that means, once again, everybody's initiative is welcome. Thank you so much, and I'm thrilled to see you tuning in. And now I'm going to hand the virtual mic to Ilya Kliger, who is going to moderate and introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anne. Yes, and I would just like to quickly introduce our next speaker today, Helen Stuhr-Rommereim, who's a PhD candidate in comparative literature at the University of Pennsylvania, and whose current work reflected in part in the initiative of the Other 19V group is on Chernyshevsky and the literary raznochinцы in the context of realist prose. Helen.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming to this event. So I'm going to talk about this project that's come out of 19V, the Other 19V, and I'm now going to share my screen, which I hope happens without any problem. Okay. So first, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the thought that went into the reading group and also make a brief case for why reading minor writers is important, which is kind of the ethos behind the group. But first I want to thank Anne for really suggesting that we start this group in the first place, and also leading our first meeting, which we had last month on Melnikov-Pechersky, as well as Sarah Dickinson, who's been helping me organize things and also helped to draft the kind of statement of purpose description of the group that I'm drawing from in this presentation. Also Vadim Schneider and Bella Grigoryan and Ilya Kliger, who all have participated in the first meeting and kind of helped get things going. So the mechanics of the group are really pretty simple. Each meeting we discuss a new writer. Each meeting is led by someone who's proposed this writer to be discussed, having come across them in their research and become interested in them for one reason or another. And we have kind of general temporal parameters of 1837 to 1905, which is basically because the people involved so far are generally interested in realism, but it's something that can, be adjusted, not a hard line. So the first kind of practical questions that emerge: who counts as a minor writer, and what does it involve to lead one of these meetings? And of course, as Anne is saying, in some sense, this is an intuitive question. Some writers are clearly not minor, and in a lot of other cases, who is considered minor is going to look fairly different depending on where we're coming from. And in particular, a lot of writers who are not discussed very often outside of Russia are really well known and really studied in the Russian context. Maybe all of these writers in this cartoon to the right, Grigorovich, Turgenev, Ostrovsky, Tolstoy would be major in the Russian context, and in the US, at least Grigorovich would be quite a minor writer, and maybe even Ostrovsky. At least there's pretty limited research focused on his work. So, the answer to the question is from the perspective of the person proposing the writer, and I hope that the group will include at least scholars and colleagues from Russia and the US and Europe, so that we'll have a chance to talk about why it is that one writer is read so much more in one context or another. Because I think the unclear definition of minorness is really a productive problem, and one that we can always be kind of thinking about and working through in the context of the group. The second question, what does it entail to lead one of these meetings? The basics are quite simple: to choose a text, a short text, 10 or so pages, probably an excerpt from a novel in a lot of cases, or a relatively short story, to describe to the group how you came across this writer, why you chose this text, where your interest came from, and some limited bibliography background materials that also came up during the course of research. So it's not, shouldn't require extra new research in order to lead such a discussion. And also, and this is something that we discussed as we were preparing to have the first meeting, the expectation is not that the person presenting on the writer will be an expert on this writer, will have an exhaustive knowledge of their body of work, or know everything about them, and it's not a context for presenting, finished research. And from a kind of practical perspective, almost by definition, a lot of these writers are not going to be the primary focus of anybody's research. And so there might not be many people who really are experts on these writers. And so, that expectation would really limit who we were able to talk about. But maybe kind of more fundamentally, it's not a context for presenting finished work. It's really an open space for having exciting conversations of perhaps a lighter nature than that whatever's going on in this chodka, in this painting. And so having this context for approaching a text, reading it together outside of anybody's research agenda, I think is part of what is really exciting and potentially productive about the reading group. So to take an example from my own perspective, my dissertation project is on 1860s Starożytne writers, and it's quite often the case that, although maybe many people know the writers that I'm working on, like Pomilovsky, Reshetnikov, Nikolai Uspensky, the specific texts that I'm looking at in my research are, maybe not many people have read them, and I don't necessarily have a lot of interlocutors to talk about these texts with. And then inevitably, when I'm presenting my research, the conversation that takes place about those texts is really oriented by my research questions and my interest in those texts. So this is a context where I'll be able to share a text and talk about a writer, and simply hear what other people think and see in this work, which is inevitably going to be a really different kind of conversation than it would be if I were presenting the same text in the context of my own research. And as a participant, although I'm reading all of these minor writers of a particular tendency and category, they are really all of one type. So in this context, I'll be able to encounter other writers that are kind of randomly, but not randomly, brought to the group based on others' interests, and just kind of read around in the period, which is, I think it's something that it's rare to have the opportunity or kind of impetus to do that. And it's really common, almost inevitable and necessary for our research interest to really channel our reading and thinking in this way. So I hope that the other 19B can just be a context for kind of uniquely open-ended discussion And I think there's potential for there to be a lot of new ideas for teaching and research that come out of that, and even this very simple thing. So I want to just make a general case for why it's important to read minor writers, just to read even some of the most unknown and strange texts from this period. Of course, the 19th century Russian literature is dominated by some of the most major of major writers whose work is rich and voluminous enough to be a whole field of study in itself, which is the wealth of our field and a wonderful thing. But it also means that these writers become kind of centers of gravity for understanding the period as a whole. And you know, even for studying Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, of course, reading more broadly in the 19th century can help give us a different understanding or the context of their work. But in this context where we're looking specifically at an unknown writer and an unfamiliar text, it's an opportunity to have a discussion where the major works and writers aren't the poles around which our consideration of the literature is oriented, and we can kind of view the field and the literary sphere of the time from a new perspective, to approach it as a time of kind of unprecedented diversity and flourishing of writers who are from different backgrounds, more women writers, more different kinds of genres being explored, a real explosion of print culture, and also think about broader processes taking place culturally and historically from a new vantage point, kind of reoriented around an unfamiliar figure and an unfamiliar text. And finally, it gives a chance to think about why the literature that we're teaching and studying most frequently occupies the position that it occupies in the canon and in our curriculum. And on this point, I'll just bring up a very brief example from our first meeting. So we were discussing Melnikov-Pechersky and his novel, 1874 novel In the Forests, which is focused on this highly geographically, culturally specific group of wealthy Old Believer peasants, and they're depicted as extremely exotic, particular, and kind of ethnically specific, but at the same time more Russian than any Russian who has come in contact with the broader world could ever possibly be. So we were talking about this kind of paradoxical representation of Russianness that appears in this novel, and I think it was Bella Grigoryan, I think, who posed this question: is a book like Oblomov more translatable and more teachable than Vlesach because it makes a less messy point about Russian history and culture? And I found this question exciting, and it led to a really interesting and productive discussion about how Russianness is taught in a 19th century course, how this is shaped by the texts that we typically taught and how it might look differently if we were to teach a text like Vlesach, and what would go into actually trying to teach that text. You would need a translation, and you know, it's a challenge. And ultimately, the point isn't that anyone's going to rush to replace Oblomov on a syllabus with Melnikov-Pechersky, but rather that just reading this text and focusing specifically on this writer for an hour and a half provides an opportunity to think in a new way about how we read Oblomov and how we teach Oblomov and how we teach the 19th century in general. And you know, even if we all recognize that literary canon isn't the result of objective measures of literary worth, but the product of historical and social processes, it can be really difficult to think outside of the canon, and especially to think about how the canon as it is shapes our view of the history and culture of the century overall. And I think this quite simple, quite humble project provides a really natural opportunity to have those kinds of conversations, and it's really fun and productive. So that's really all I have, and I'll just share my screen once more and have the upcoming meetings here. So June 18th and July 16th. And this is organized through a Facebook group that anyone can join, but it is a closed group. So you just have to request and then you'll be added. And I can share the address for the Facebook group in the chat. But if you search the other 19B, you will also find it. So thank you. That's all.
Great. Thanks so much, Helen, for this presentation and for taking the initiative with this project. So our next speaker is Margaret Shama from Parsons School of Design, whose current work is on the Russian female nude. Margaret. Margaret, you're muted, I think.
Great. So I've shared my slides and I'm going to suggest that you minimize your speaker screen or so that you don't have bobbing heads where interrupting with the slides. Today I'm going to say a few words about my current project, Russian Venus, how it relates to the state of the field and how it intersects with 19V. When I say the field, I'm emphasizing English language work on the 19th century Russian art and design. Of course, I draw on Russian scholarship, but I'll leave it to our Russian colleagues on this call to offer their assessment of it. Currently, the field is dominated by trained art historians, whereas in the past, there were many more contributors from history and literature. So this means that we bring a deep knowledge of the history of art and design, techniques of visual analysis, and theoretical approaches that are common in our discipline. In art history, studying the female nude dates back to feminist work of the 1970s through 1990s. My approach certainly builds on this feminist background, but instead of focusing on the subject position of women, I'm more interested in the specifically Russian reception of European imagery, the art market, and how social class and education shape viewers' tastes. Artists have historically considered the female nude to be the pinnacle of artistic achievement as a symbol of beauty, an emblem of art itself. In the Renaissance, artists like Titian depicted the female form to measure themselves against the ancients. By the early 19th century, artists like Ingres no longer used a narrative pretext like Venus for these images, and the female nude became its own genre. By the late 19th century, the nude became the perfect vehicle for rebellion against centuries of artistic tradition. So given my art historical background, when I started working on Russian art, I wanted to know, where are the female nudes in 19th century Russia? How did the Russian art world fit into this major European development? So in terms of 19V's questions, the founding questions, at some points I integrate Russian art and design into a larger European context, and at other times I insist on Russian particularity. So in my research, I found that some of the very first works of European art brought to Russia for Peter the Great, the Summer Garden sculptures, included many nudes. In later generations, imperial and aristocratic collectors acquired works like this Italian painting of Susanna and the Elders. After it entered the Hermitage, a serf copied it for the Sheremetyev's billiard room at Kuskovo, where it joined other images of nude and partially draped female figures. So not only were these works acceptable, but they were also desirable. They appeared in every major 18th century Russian collection. These aristocratic collectors created a demand for European-style images of the female nude that Russian artists sought to fill. So you can see that my project is very involved in the history of collecting, which has become a major branch of art historical studies in Europe, the US, and in Russia. In addition to sculpture and painting, I'm also looking at decorative arts, such as ceiling painting, stucco work, tapestry, silver, porcelain, objects that people saw and used in their everyday lives. So here I overlap with the visual culture, material culture people. Artists who traveled abroad to France and Italy produced highly polished nudes on a par with their European counterparts, which brought them attention back home. Runi's Bacchante entered the new Russian galleries at the Hermitage, where it was one of the most popular works for copyists until the end of the century. Markov's Fortuna and the Beggar was based on a fable by Ivan Krylov, and it earned Markov the title academician. So clearly, we can see that nudes were not taboo in Russia. They were a prestigious subject, just as they were in Europe. New publications could help to educate viewers about how to look at the nude. Alexei Yegorov's Susanna appeared in Severnye Tsvety in 1826 to accompany an article by Vasily Grigorovich, The State of the Arts in Russia. His text guides the reader's eye to Yegorov's, quote, most pleasing overall tone, the sweetness of his brushwork, the charm of the face, the luminosity and the tenderness of the body, the purple and white clothing that lend brilliance to the figure, end quote. So for this literary audience, the text models how to view the nude from an aesthetic distance. Yegorov's image became so popular that sculptor Ivan Kuznetsov translated it into a series of small wooden statuettes, which were very popular. Painted copies, prints, and other reproductions of these images accessible to middle market made these images accessible to middle market collectors who could not afford original works of art. And here my project clearly overlaps with many participants in 19V working on the intersection of taste and social class, periodical publications, and middle-brow perceptions of high culture. So one reason that Russian nudes are not well known is that some of them are just not very good. And here is, I think, an example. These paintings are all in museum storage. They're frankly not worth exhibiting or even studying as individual works of art. But collectively, they do tell us something about the art market, like an artist making 2 copies of his painting in different sizes, as we see at the left, obviously for different prices, different ranks of collectors. They also tell us about the tastes of collectors who are not connoisseurs of art, mostly the middling classes, but also people of the very highest rank. The lower right painting by Nikolai Maikov was acquired by Nicholas I for his study at Yelagan-Ostrovsky Palace. So if Helen's group is reading minor writers, I'm looking at minor painters, not to emphasize what they lack or to criticize their work, but to highlight what a collector of this period might have seen in them, which seems to be they were looking for a kind of an old master quality that would give their collection and themselves a sense of distinction. The nude became popular enough in Russia that artists made paintings like these on speculation for the market, and people were willing to buy them. I also study artists' models. Art academies hired only male models to pose for life classes. So depicting the male nude was associated with advanced students or artists seeking official recognition. Artists could only hire female models privately. So they would sometimes, as we see here, they would sometimes depict themselves working from a female model to signal their independent professional status. My work on artists' models draws on memoirs and correspondence, as well as prose and poetry. So like others in 19V, I integrate various forms of literary and artistic production. Serf artists often worked as copyists instead of working from live models. They were not always trained in artistic conventions of depicting the female form, so that when they produced original works of art, like this, a small painting, oil on copper, they sometimes included naturalistic bodily details that other artists would not. Incidentally, Litunov's owner was Lev Alexeyevich Yakovlev, the uncle of Alexander Herzen, and Litunov actually gave drawing lessons to the young Alexander Herzen and his cousin Tatiana. Like others in 19V, I'm interested in the question of realism, both the illusionism or naturalism of artistic depictions and the realist movement of the later 19th century, when artists and critics started questioning the artistic conventions and tastes of the past. So here I'll just conclude by saying that our field is small but vibrant and very collegial. We have a lot of exciting and very diverse recent publications in our field in English language study of 19th century Russian art and design. We have an active professional society called Shira, and there are many ways in which our work intersects with the work of other scholars in 19V. So we look forward to collaborating with you. Since today's discussion will focus exclusively on 19V and its initiatives, if you have any questions or comments about my project specifically, please do send me an email. Thank you. And I will return to Ilya.
Great. Thanks so much, Margaret, for opening the interdisciplinary section of our group. And our next speaker is Ani Kokobobo from University of Kansas, whose current work is on gender in Tolstoy and beyond. I don't see you, Ani, but I think you are here.
I'm here.
Yes, hi.
Do you see me?
I see you.
Do you hear me? Do you want me to just go ahead? Okay. I'm just not seeing, I'm still seeing you in the speaker window instead of me, but but that's fine. I don't care, but
We're seeing you, Annie.
oh, okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. Anna's in New York. I'm in the Midwest. I've just snuck into my campus because it's the only place where Zoom works. So this is not my home. This is, in fact, our Slavic library here at the University of Kansas. So Anne asked me a little while ago as this initiative was being launched and to kind of, start off with something really sort of meta about the field and I decided to, I'm thinking and writing about gender a lot lately. So I thought I will just, I'll just talk about gender and, you've all read that piece. So I won't rehash, or you might have read that piece, so I won't rehash a lot of what I said in that piece, but I will rehash some of the things that I'd mentioned. One of the things that really struck out to me as I was thinking about gender and the field, and specifically 19th century, the study of 19th century Russian realism, was that I had written this entire dissertation in graduate school about the body and its grotesqueness, and a lot of what I talk about are protrusions, intrusions, disturbances of bodily integrity, and I had done all of this without really addressing sexuality until I got to the book phase and added more to it. And, that struck me as really interesting and really peculiar, the amount of work that I had done to sort of like dance around this topic. And so that then, had me thinking further to this experience that I had when I got to writing the conclusion to the book, which then ended up launching me, the project itself seemed to sort of be possessed and launching me into all of these directions of gender and sexuality. And, of course, at the moment I realized fairly quickly that, this wasn't going to be the conclusion to the book, because I hadn't been writing very much about these topics in the book. So I put it away, but I thought for the purposes of this presentation, in a sort of return of the repressed, I would kind of revive this document and talk a bit about some of the things that had drawn me in writing that and that I had put away. And perhaps, because I think more than anything, rather than being a conclusion to anything, it sort of raised important questions about things that, I'm interested in, that, I think I would love to see more work on. And so, just to give you just a little bit of context, in my book, I had talked about the grotesque as an aesthetic category and the ways in which Russian writers used it to sort of depict a decline of the family and of the traditional way of life in 19th century Russia, and specifically after the Great Reforms. And so, one good example that you might think of is Saltykov-Shchedrin's Господа Головлёвы, of course, as this very sort of archetypal reflection of grotesque realism. And I would say of all my works, that's the most sort of like straight out grotesque work. And, what's interesting though, that I've started to think about is that also the grotesque is often an idiom for sexuality. And so I think, rather than talking about the grotesque, I'd like to talk more about the ways in which it can then jump up into sort of broader investigations of the wide range of sexualities that we see in the 19th century Russian novel. And, in particular, in this document that I'd written years ago, I was getting really caught up on some of the work that I know Laura Engelstein has done on this question. And she quotes Foucault in particular, and here Foucault is talking about legal and religious discourses in the 18th century, and he talks about quote unquote peripheral sexualities as defined in those discourses, and specifically sexuality outside of heterosexual monogamy. And again, this sounds very pejorative in many ways, and I think it's intended to be. But again, in these, Foucault describes these quote unquote peripheral sexualities as the sexuality of children, madmen and women, criminals, the sexuality of those who did not like the opposite sex, reveries, obsessions, petty manias, great transports or rage. And that's Foucault. And again, looking at those categories and with all the pejorative connotations that they have, and again, think about where they're coming from, this 18th century legal discourses. And thinking about my own book, I was thinking about the range of sexualities we see in the novels that we study and the kind of peripheral, quote unquote, sexualities, non-normative sexualities that we see. And, I wanted to sort of bring out a couple of examples of these. And, one thing that I've also been writing about now is nihilists. And we see a lot of nihilists in these novels. And a lot of their political activities, even though they're, politically motivated, tend to kind of play out in the sphere of sexuality, which I think is also an interesting question, as social and sexual transgressions. But, we can think about Obrev by Goncharov, which we never talk about. That belongs maybe in Helen's group. But I've written about this novel a little bit, and one thing that really has struck me recently as I'm writing about it from this perspective is that Mark Volkov is extremely opposed to the suppression of desire and individuality and monogamy, and his sexuality always falls outside the bounds of marriage. And so, one of the questions that I've been thinking about is, could we be talking about a queer nihilist in a broader sense, outside of just Obrev? And queer theorists encourage us to think about and talk about sort of queerness as a mode of living in a temporality and outside the sort of conventional, sexuality categorization, and, outside of the sort of conventional heterosexuality and reproduction. So that was one question that I had found in this document that I wanted to throw out there. And then another thing is another topic potentially is Dostoevsky. And there's a lot of really interesting work happening right now on Dostoevsky and sexuality, which is really encouraging and exciting. I had really found myself thinking a lot about sort of demons. That is sort of increasingly probably my favorite Dostoevsky novel. But, I think about Stavrogin as a kind of grotesque gentry hero who, seduces a little girl but doesn't marry his social equal, Lisa, but sleeps with her. And then she has this hysterical breakdown. And then his sort of interest in the virginal but disabled Maria Timofeyevna, and you know, and then Brothers Karamazov with Fyodor and his, you know, elderly libido that can't find a productive outlet, and his sort of obsession with women that are often disabled. And all of this sort of leads up to a question for me about disability and sexuality and Dostoevsky, you know, which again, I would love to sort of think and talk about and explore. And for my part, I've been talking about, I've been writing and thinking a lot about Tolstoy and sexuality. And this started, of course, for me with the late Tolstoy, where he's sort of really overt about these questions. But then I've been going backwards in my book and looking at his early diaries, which, you know, we have all of Tolstoy begins with that statement about how he got gonorrhea, you know, his first sort of diary entry. And, you know, leading, you know, him finding sort of space and narrative for sexuality, and then eventually just talking about how sexuality kills women. And, you know, and then I discovered as I was doing some of this work that, you know, feminist thinker, second wave feminist thinker Andrea Dworkin had discovered the Chorus Sonata and basically bases the opening chapter of her book Intercourse on Tolstoy. And of course she hates Tolstoy, but then she really finds his ideas about how sexuality is destroying women. I mean, sexuality and patriarchy is something that kills women. That to her is deeply compelling, you know, and it was just amazing to me to sort of discover that and to learn that from Andrea Dworkin when, you know, I've been in this field for many years, and you know, it was just really powerful to sort of think along those lines, and to see how much Tolstoy had played a role in her thinking, and she's also making a comeback now in the era of Me Too. And in any case, I will, you know, one of the sort of other funny experiences that I have in the context of writing about Tolstoy and sexuality is that many people outside the field, when I mentioned what I'm working on, are really surprised that this book hasn't been written already, and that, you know, there are not like several volumes of it. And so in any case, I'm not going to belabor with examples because I think it would trivialize what I think is a huge and not tapped question in the field. But, you know, whenever I think about the distinctiveness of the Russian novel, and you know, it is a very distinctive and weird genre, it just seems really important that the question of sexuality be part of that broader discussion and helping us explore all the ways in which these works are distinctive. And so, you know, I guess I will end there with two things. The first is, I can't decide why this is the case. I mean, of course we talk about these questions, but why don't we talk about them more? And I don't have an answer. I used to always think that it was some kind of conservatism and hostility. I'm trying not to think that those are the answers. I'm trying to be more open and think more broadly about why this might be the case. And I don't know if the answer will help in remedying the situation, and I don't know whether the answer really matters. But the second piece for me, and I apologize, Anne, that I promised that I would do something and I didn't, because, you know, it's a pandemic and parenting and school and work, and so I flaked out. But the second part is that I want to try to do something about it, which is that I would really like, for those of us who are interested in these questions, to maybe form a working group, not quite that would be perhaps a little bit different than what Helen and others are doing. And it's not to say that it wouldn't overlap, because I think so many, you know, women writers that are some of the main writers that we don't read, you know, particularly in the 19th century. But, you know, specifically on to have a kind of gender studies and 19th century studies working group, and have sort of working papers and try to support and encourage each other, so that some of this work doesn't feel like it's happening in a vacuum, which I confess is really what it feels like now. So that's really what I'm thinking, and I will try. I really like the Facebook group kind of platform that Helen has done. And so maybe that might be a way to organize this, though I don't think everyone is on Facebook necessarily, and Facebook is increasingly more and more evil, so I don't want to, I don't know. So I have mixed feelings about that, but I think I'll try to work on this and others. And if you're interested in sort of participating and sharing work or reading others' work, or have any ideas, please contact me. That's all I got.
Okay, thank you so much, Ani. So our next speaker is Bella Grigoryan from University of Pittsburgh, whose current work is on the press and its publics. Bella?
Okay. Can you guys see I think I'm sharing my screen successfully?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, you see, okay. So at the moment, I'm working on a book called Reading the Paper in Nikolaev in Russia. And it's about the politics and materiality of reading during the notoriously repressive reign of Nicholas I. I'm interested in middling culture. I opt for the term middling because it adumbrates two conceptual categories that have been central to the field-shaping history of 19th century reading in the West, the middle brow and the middle class. At its core, my book is animated by questions about middle class culture, its global histories, and its local meanings. This study contemplates the shapes and possibilities of the cultural middle in an absolutist autocracy. Although, of course, no Russian middle class existed as a legal category, many commercially successful writers addressed their works to persons of the middling estate, люди среднего состояния, as they sometimes themselves put it. Recent historical scholarship has begun to trace the outlines of a Russian middling public comprised chiefly of the urban service nobility, provincial nobles of average means, merchants, and well-to-do townspeople, that is, say, mещане. Trained to study literature, I engage pretty rigorously with Russian historical scholarship and offer a humanist emphasis on the pervasive imbrication of the materiality, aesthetics, and politics of reading during Nicholas I's reign. By foregrounding the newspaper and the journal as objects that shape the worlds they traverse, my study traces a Russian negotiation of quasi and pre-political publics in ways that should prompt us to do two things. One, to think farther about the agentive potential of print specifically and the middle class object world generally. And two, to revisit and reconsider the relationship between mass culture and representative democratic politics as it has been articulated by public sphere theory scholarship that deals with European and North American states. Shaped by an eclectic methodological toolbox that ranges from new materialism to public sphere theory and literary analysis, this study seeks to contribute to a better integrated comparative discipline of 19th century literary and cultural studies. I work with canonical texts to a certain extent, but for the most part, like a number of people I think in 19V, I'm interested in relatively minor writers. I read such successful but now neglected writer-journalists as Fadei Bulgarin, Osip Sinkovsky, Nikolai Grech, in addition to many others whose names have dropped out of literary history. So here's my first image. It's from the 1840s and it's called Near Smerzin's bookstore. It features Sinkovsky, Grech, and Bulgarin going to visit the bookseller Smerzin with comically pugnacious intent. Their ridiculous animus would have confirmed the Russian elite literati's impression that these journalists, whom Smerzin paid handsomely, had all but bankrupted their boss. The image turns upon the period's anxious acknowledgement of the commodification of culture. Here's another image, a very famous one, an oft reproduced drawing by Alexandre Brulot, called Торжественный обед в книжной лавке Смердина, from 1832. And here's the 1833 Novicemia that's served as its cover, and it's also a very famous, of course, image. Smerdin was turning a good profit, and they're celebrating his move to a new centrally located store on Nevsky. It's possible to identify the guests. You have the fabulist Krylov, Smerdin standing, the poet Khvostov, Pushkin, Vyatemsky, Grech proposing a toast, the censor Semyonov, and Fadei Bulgaria. Here's an image from an 1846 issue of the satirical Yeralash. It's called Procession to the Temple of Fame. And you can see Bulgarian is going towards fame on his Northern Bee. Gogol is asleep on completing volume 2 of Dead Souls, and you can play a kind of parlor game of trying to identify the rest of these folks, and perhaps the other 19V could one day identify all of them and understand what the joke is about each one, because there's a reason that there's a bear or various other ways in which these writers are depicted. Anyway, here's of course another very, very famous image from 1856, just past the chronological endpoint of my study of the writers connected to the contemporary. So I bring up these images because I think they caution us from studying canonical writers as luminaries in a vacuum. In the case of my book, each chapter includes a short reading of a relatively canonical literary text, but again, it's a short reading, and the bulk of each chapter is really concerned with newspapers and journals as material agents of the cultural middle. And here we come to, I think, a major question facing 19th century Russian studies, in a particular way outside of Russia. How to work on relatively minor writers and non-literary texts while navigating, for example, a North American discipline that continues to be shaped by the author function and the attendant focus on canonical figures. In my own study, I go, in a way you could say, farther or off-field entirely, or in a different direction, because I actually foreground not so much authors as the very traffic in print. I'm interested in telling a story that's less about humans and more about things, journals and newspapers as objects and media forms, paying attention to why subjects would record about the look and feel of the page, the smell and texture of paper, to think holistically about the materiality of 19th century reading. So what happens to 19th century Russian literary studies when we move away from the author function? Well, I think Russian culture begins to look less exceptional. It may begin to look more commercial. It may begin to look less hostile to byt. The political labels we assign to it might change. Writers like Pushkin and Gogol might appear less protean and more shaped by their circumstances. I suspect, moreover, that the comparative lens that we've long trained on Russia begins to shift. In its attention to the relationship between culture and politics, my study responds to one of the cardinal questions in Russian historiography. To what extent did the Russian Empire develop in concert with familiar West European patterns of social, cultural, political, and economic progress? The democratization of reading in the West has long been understood to yield the formation of a politically powerful bourgeois public sphere. But what happens when something that looks quite a bit like middle-class culture develops in an autocracy? It is among the study's chief contentions that the Russian negotiation of pre- and quasi-political publics should prompt us to revisit and to reformulate the correlation between representative democratic politics and the rise of print capitalism. Further, it seems to me that the long-lived practice of considering 19th century Russian culture in relation mainly to 3 European traditions, French, English, and German, should probably be revisited. Even though my own work responds to this challenge in a narrow way, I would nonetheless ask us, how would the tradition we study look in a more richly articulated global 19th century? I think part of decolonizing the discipline means coming to our sources with fewer expectations. In my case, this means recalibrating a range of assumptions about the relationship between print and culture, or print and politics. In recent years, historians have challenged the belief that Imperial Russia lacked the institutions of civil society. But in contrast to what we've learned from public sphere theory and history in the West, in Imperial Russia, its institutional cores, sites of sociability ranging from the press to the gentleman's club, tended not to endorse or presume an oppositional orientation towards the state. Instead, they could function as semi-autonomous spheres of activity fostered by or working in concert with the polity. So in linking aesthetics with politics, my work brings a humanist's point of view to this broader enterprise of really rethinking the shape and the possibilities of civil society in Russia specifically, and perhaps in a more conceptual sense, rethinking the relationship between print and absolutism, print and autocracy. To the extent that mine is a book about Nikolaev and Russia, animated by questions about middling and middle-class culture, its global histories and local meanings, I'm speaking mostly in favor of moving past a range of narratives about Russian exceptionalism or Russian difference. And this responds, I think, to the periodization question that was raised by our collective, particularly in Anne's inaugural post on the Jordan Center website. Until late in the 20th century, the imperial period, and especially the 19th century Russian literary and intellectual history, were seen as precursors to the Soviet state, or even as keys to understanding the Kremlin. In 2020, that view is no longer adequate. And this is the case for a range of different reasons, some of them having to do, among other things, with lessening degrees of cultural essentialism in our approach to the region. So in the end, I'm hopeful that our collective will foster cross-disciplinary conversations about a range of topics, some of which I've touched upon. These include a move away from the canon and the author function in favor of alternative strategies of making sense of our period, reinvestment in material and new political histories of the 19th century, and perhaps an embrace of world or global 19th century studies as the context in which our work might proceed.
Great. Thank you so much, Bella. Okay, so thank you everybody for the presentations. And now we are moving on to the less formal part of the meeting, but though hopefully not too chaotic. And I just wanted to repeat Sasha's request earlier on that if possible, you post or rather announce the fact that you would like to raise a question or make a comment in the chat section, so that I could then, rather than by raising your hand, just say comment or question, and then you will line up and I will just call on you in the order in which the questions or comments are received. And also I just wanted to point out that we definitely welcome both questions and comments in Russian. So please, yes, please just alert me to the fact that you would like to speak, and I will hopefully not mess this up and will call on you. So far I'm not seeing anything. Sasha, if you have.
Yeah, so, oh, there we go. There's one. So everyone could just be sure to make sure that when you're sending your messages, they are being sent to everyone. So if you go into if you open your chat window, you'll see at the bottom, there's two, it says two, and then you can pick who you're sending your message to. So just keep an eye on that before you send any messages out, because it can get confusing.
Great. So I have a question from Piotr Akser. Please just speak up.
Yes, thank you. Those were very informative talks, and I very much appreciate being here. I have a question for Bella. I wonder if you have any ideas about how works, for example, novels that were written in the periodicals of the day were read alongside other texts within a given journal. So, for example, I haven't looked at the issues in which Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov were published, but it occurs to me that a text about a murder of a father that's being judged by peasants in a courtroom setting is probably, if not in that specific issue in which the Dimitri's courtroom case is being published, could be within, you know, the journal's yearly editions, be compared to other texts about medicine, about courtroom issues, about jury trials that were newly instated in Russia at the time and things like this. So have you found any information about how texts in a given journal were read alongside their other, the other articles within that journal, or how we might be able to understand certain texts that were serially published alongside what other topics were being discussed in those journals?
Thanks. I think that's a great question, and I think there are multiple ways of approaching it. And I know that a number of people in this virtual room have approached just those questions. So, for instance, you can certainly read a work in its media environment, in the sense of thinking about how it responds to the ongoing critical commentary, right, that sometimes attends its publication, which is to say that it's not uncommon for works of literature, particularly the bigger novels that were serialized, to respond to the very process of serialization whether in their thematic content or from a different point of view in their kind of formal tools and in strategies. So the other thing I guess I would mention in connection with that second point is that I find very compelling the notion that in some sense the Russian realist novel looks quite a bit, or looks like or borrows from the thick journal when it comes to its own sort of shape. So if you think of something like the tendency in Anna Karenina or in Bratья Karamazovы towards this kind of shuttling where action might be taking place presumably at the same time in multiple different places, right? So you're moved from one location to another location to another. Well, that's quite a bit like the front page of a newspaper. I mean, there's a compositional kind of analogy or parallel to the way periodicals work, where a reader of a periodical by nature follows multiple stories at once. So there's a way in which one could also make an argument that these are cultural forms or media forms that train cognitive attention in similar ways. Right, again, in the sense that you're following and you're paying attention to multiple narratives over a long span of time. And there's much more that could be said about this, but I think I'm going to stop there because I see we have many questions. Thank you for that.
I just wanted to make one quick comment about the comments, which is to say that we're definitely welcome. So I will, of course, go through the list of the questions that we have received already, but generally, sort of broader questions about, instead of directly to speakers, broader questions about what the project might look like, or comments about what the project might look like. So this is more of a brainstorming session as we conceived of it than of a set of questions to individual speakers, which of course can be addressed to them, over email and in other ways. So yes, so the next question I have is from Georgi Kupashvili.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, organizers, for this opportunity. My question is really broad in my sense, in my interest, at least. And as you guess, I'm speaking from Georgia. And my question is if Georgia or the, let's say, entire Russian Empire will be included in the project, if it's within the interest, because let's say the author that all of you know, Chernin, who narrowly defined Russian culture as Russian nationally or ethnically, and another scholar, less known, who spoke about передвижники in different later Soviet nations. So my question is this, whether you will be interested in other Russian nations or ethnicities, such as Caucasian, Central Asian, maybe partially also Poland and so on. I'm sure you understood my question.
Yeah, thank you so much. Would anyone of our speakers like to address this?
Because, may I add something? Because I define my topic somewhere between Russian and Middle Eastern studies.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Great. And please.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And my reaction would be that we would welcome work like this. I mean, we're thinking about, when we say Russian, we're really thinking work in Russian, you know, so meaning primary texts that are mostly in Russian, but and you may be working in primary texts in other languages as well. And I think we would certainly welcome that kind of work. So thank you.
Thank you too.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say that we have with us Valeria Sobol, for example, if I'm not mistaken, who is doing work on Russian Ukrainian, and of course a lot of people know Harsha Ram's work specifically pertaining to Georgia and Russia and sort of broader questions. So absolutely yes, that's also my sense. Okay, the next question comes from Kirill Spavat.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers for providing this fantastic lineup of different directions in which we can or should be going in simultaneously. And the one that I'm more competent to comment on is Bella's. And I was thinking about kind of all the major questions that Bella raised, starting from the kind of the whole issue of the physical presence of the book, but then kind of we have the whole issue of Russia versus the West and public sphere, absolutism, and opposition, and all of those concepts are central to my own thinking about what is going on, but also about kind of how do we fit Russia into the broader picture of what is going on in the world, but also in Europe, right? Because that's also part of what we have to solve. And the general point that I want to make is that the picture that Bella drew of a culture that sort of has a middle class, which is not called that way, and has a public sphere, which is not absolutist. There's nothing specific to Russia about this, right? While we tend to kind of, once we think about Russia and the West in terms of public sphere, we tend to speak about absolutist Russia and the liberal West, which is of course not true for the 19th century, right? More specifically, what we have in Russia is what we have in Prussia, in more than one respect. Right. So this whole model of the Prussian, then we have the French Second Empire, which is a pretty authoritarian place, which is also central to 19th century development. So this is one respect in which Russia, for all its absolutism, is not actually excluded from European developments, right? And this gives us also a chance to speak, to think about the categories which we use to compare, to draw those comparisons, and to look at the European and Russian experience, right? To question our own assumptions in a productive way, because I think that once we start actually questioning our assumptions about the differences between Russia and the West, we will be getting a lot of information out of it. And so I think this is a very productive way going forward. What is a public sphere in Russia and in the West, and how our own assumptions should be elaborated further, right, to make sense. And another kind of related point is that kind of I've been thinking about the different formulas of Russian nationalism. which abound in this period, specifically about the whole kind of vision of Russia as Troika and the end of Mертвые души and all of that thing. And kind of the paradox that I ran across was that we tend to take those nationalist visions as something for granted, right? We assume that late Gogol is a Russian nationalist who is an isolationist, the opposite of a Westernizer, right? Which is what he actually says, right? But if we start looking at the language he uses, we'll find that this is kind of, that's been my conclusion, right? We find that his language of thinking and speaking about Russia's exceptionality is very much connected to Western languages of speaking about exceptionality and backwardness, for example, for Prussia or for France, right? And we can see how this whole assemblage of kind of some kind of a Western center, which is England or France, versus some kind of a pseudo backwardness, which has to be fashioned as exceptionality, it is not unique to the Russian situation. This is what basically everyone is doing, right, at that time. So again, even with tropes of exceptionality and uniqueness, we end up in a space which is shared between languages and cultures. And I think our understanding of what's going on in 19th century Russian texts can be kind of hugely enriched by this perspective. In that sense, I would just second kind of Bella's indication that this is the direction that we should be going into.
Or at least a direction.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Bella, would you like to briefly respond or second the seconding?
I definitely second the seconding, and I would also say that I think that sort of the hermeneutic circle that what you describe involves, or you look very closely at Russia with few expectations, like that it'll definitely be illiberal, right? If you don't come with those expectations, I think what's really lovely about what you're saying, Kirill, is then you go back to Europe and realize that the emancipatory potential that we so much associated with these cultural institutions is itself, it's a potential, it's not a given. So in other words, the liberal democratic public sphere is imperfect even where it's supposed to have existed. And the only other small thing that I'd say is in connection with what Georgi was saying, I think certainly, to compare eastward or southward, not always westward, is a really healthy direction for us to take.
Great, thank you. The next question I have is from Violet Williams.
Hi, I suppose I was just wondering if there were any plans for like the blog post in particular, I suppose is what I'm thinking of, discussing the relations of like Abramtsevo and Berendipka and the way in which the West views Russia, I suppose, and the way that we view like Russian quote unquote identity. Yeah. If that makes sense, I suppose.
Anne?
It definitely makes sense, and I think it would be a great topic for a blog post. So propose one. I think that's, part of what we're doing is really meta, because we're such a big collective and come from so many different places. It gives us a chance to reflect on how we see each other working in different scholarly traditions. And I think that would be a great kind of entry into questions like that. So if you're interested, we would certainly be excited to hear about it. Thank you.
Okay, sweet. Thank you very much.
Good.
Okay, the next question I have here is from Nadezhda Kizenko.
Hi. Actually, it's Kitsenko, but okay.
Kitsenko, I'm sorry.
My question is this. That you've been talking about minor writers, and that's very, very helpful. My question is, would this group be open to considering minor genres? Which is to say that most of the writing that I've come across for the 19th century are things like religious writing, devotional writing, women's writing, written confessions, right? Women's writing guides for their children on how to learn how to confess. So in other words, we're talking about a different kind of genre, like an autobiographical genre, a life writing genre, a narrative genre, which is not what one typically associates with, let's say, finished works, although one could argue that Lidia Charskaya comes out of this as well. But would that be a possibility?
Anne, please.
I'm sorry to keep addressing all these, but it's because I'm eager to say yes. I think that, and one reason that this interests me particularly is that I feel like my own, and this is probably, I'm not alone in this, that my own relatively weak understanding of orthodoxy, of Russian Orthodoxy, and the way it informs kinds of writings, I think that that is really a deficit for me and probably for others of us too. And so looking at genres that say that of the type that you're describing could be really useful. I could even imagine a small working group of people who are interested in texts like this, but not necessarily familiar with the tradition. I think that that's, for me, that's precisely the kind of thing I would hope to be able to learn from a group like this. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just like also to second this by saying that, you know, as far as the work on the major writers is concerned, it is, I think, impossible to do serious work on them without taking into consideration the sorts of genres, especially novelists, right? The sorts of genres that are flowing into the novel more broadly. Yes, I apologize if I mispronounce your name. Christine Rouen, if you could unmute.
Okay, I apologize. I'm a Zoom virgin. This is my first time I've
We're all like that.
I just want to thank you for a really fascinating set of presentations. And what I would like to say is that I was quite struck by Ani's comments on gender and the fact that she's struggling with this in her writings. And not very many people are writing about it and this sort of thing, because when I started off, which was a while ago, the same thing was true. And my observation over the years has been that because of the way we're sort of subdivided into disciplines, even despite disciplinarity, we still only tend to read the literature people read each other and the historians read each other, and there's not a lot of crossover. And so one of the things that I would really like to see this group move towards is encouraging that kind of, you know, reading of each other's work, because I think one of the problems that anybody doing gender faces is that most historians don't work on gender, and we're the ones who might provide the kind of context in which these works are being written and explore some of these conversations. I mean, some of us have tried to do this over the years, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done. And so as a historian, though, I would like to say this, that I've been struck by how literary our conversation has been today. So I would hope that we could get more historians involved, because we approach some of these questions differently than you do. We ask, I think, many of the same questions, but the way in which we try to answer them, I think, is different. And I think it would be helpful to both of us if we could come together and think about the questions and how they relate to one another, and how that might impact our view of the 19th century and 19th century Russian culture. And then finally, I would like to suggest, this is probably too much, but we've had so many wonderful images today. Would it be possible to include discussions of images in the minor writers group, say, someplace like that, or establish a group that does imagery? Because I think that would be enormously helpful as we all move towards using more and more images, but are less familiar with how to interpret them, or need advice from people who do this for a living, like Margaret. So I'll stop there, but thank you.
Yeah, Margaret and Helen, would you like to speak to that? Helen?
Very quickly say that I think it would be great to have historians participate in the MITRE Writers reading group, because I think it is, I mean, on the one hand, as literary scholars, sometimes I think historians might be reading a lot of writers that literary scholars don't get to because they're reading for different purpose, reading for cultural historical studies, and you know, I think, you know, the not overlapping fields of knowledge within the two fields would be especially really helpful for those discussions. So I hope that some historians will join our group. And yeah, and also discussing images. I mean, I'm just looking through some of these cartoons from the 19th century satirical journals. I think we could probably have a subgroup just for satirical cartoons, and I need to find somebody who actually knows about that stuff because they're wild and really fascinating.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'll just jump in and say a lot of us work on, I mean, the art historians and design historians and visual culture people do work on, obviously, images, and we're happy to advise our peers on it. To be able to give you a one-shot session on what we spent years acquiring, you know, it'd be like asking you to give us an hour on Russian literature. So, you know, we can certainly advise you on things, and we can certainly do sessions on individual or maybe groups of images. That would be fun. And that we do have a certain, you know, a whole apparatus of how to look at images and visual analysis and so on. We do sometimes notice when our peers in literature and history use images, and we sometimes think, oh, a missed opportunity because there's so much more you could have said that would support your argument. So we really do encourage that.
Anne, please.
Yeah, can I just add that I keep hearing the formulation, is it possible to do X? And the answer almost in every case is going to be, sure, do it. You know, we all have Google Doc with everybody's contact information at this point. And I think it's a great idea to organize kind of subgroups. That's how initiatives that we have going so far, that's precisely how they've come into being, that people said, well, why don't we try this? Well, let's do that. And they organized those efforts. So I think that that's a wonderful idea, both to include, to bring together historians, also art historians, and talk to each other. So thanks very much. It's a great idea.
Yeah, exactly. If we come out of this meeting with a number of projects for working groups, this will be a great success, I think. The next question I have here is from Enrique Diaz Duarte. Again,
Yes, yeah, it's me. Yeah. Do you all hear me?
Yes.
I hope I'm not the only one from the. Oh, sorry. There's a bye here. I hope I'm not the only one from the South speaking. I saw Bella talking about us looking a little more southward. And it's really hard to do Russian studies here in the South. I speak from Brazil. But this is why I would like to thank all the organizers for hosting such a lovely space for us to be able to catch up with the discussion up north and maybe bring a little bit of it back to the South. And since you already answered what I was going to ask, what is left to say is I would like to volunteer, if possible, or invite anyone who is interested to maybe discuss creating a working group on the legal side of history, because we often hear about the reforms and how the czars handled everything, but we don't look much at the legal aspects. And that would be very interesting to do. So if anyone is interested, I would like to hear your takes on that, because we are much in need of speaking a little more about Russia here in Brazil. And there were very similar realities. We had an empire, they had an empire. Our emperor even went to Russia to visit the czars, and he was one of the first Orientalists. He was an academician like all of us, so he took place in congresses and things of the sort. So if anyone is interested, I don't know how to proceed, but I would like to volunteer myself and also emphasize what Christine just said, that it's great when all the areas start to mingle together We from the legal world, we tend to do this even when unasked. So historians, art historians, philosophers, sociologists, it would be great to mingle everyone, especially if we can do this in the legal history kind of area. So this is basically what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much. Yes, absolutely. I'm not sure if we have a kind of logistics for starting a working group, but I think a kind of initial proposal I think would be enough, right? That then we could distribute and people could start volunteering and set up a time for meeting and so on. And
yeah, just very briefly on the issue of logistics, we have a Google Doc. I can send anybody a link if you don't have it yet. And if you don't have objections to having your name be and contact information and interests be available to everyone in the group, then you can just add those to the list and you can peruse the list yourself and as a start and see who else seems to share your interests as a kind of starting point and contact those people. So again, let me know or let the Jordan Center know if you haven't yet added your name to the Google Doc and your contact information, and we'll be happy to do so. At the moment, you know, our organization is very loose. And as far as a procedure for starting a working group, I mean, you know, пожалуйста, like let's make one up. For the moment, we exist mostly as that Google Doc. So, and that's not to say that that's the only way that we will always exist, but for now, the benefit of that is flexibility and openness. So thank you very much, and thanks for speaking to the North.
I have a couple of questions here for Margaret from Ilya and from Olga Mayorova, but if I could redirect them directly to Margaret, if that's okay, and just move on to maybe the broader questions.
Well, actually, Ilya, it's not a simple question, if I may. My name is Ilya Doronchenkov. I'm currently from Moscow, art historian. So I wanted to ask Margaret about one aspect of her very valuable study, but generally speaking, if we are talking about the strategy of this group, let me just first thank our colleagues for making it possible and say hi to those whom I know, and I see many colleagues here and many dear friends. Let me speak from my art historical perspective. And I'm so grateful to Christine that she mentioned this visual aspect of our study. As an art historian, I would challenge my friends, philosophers, and philologists by saying that what is not visualized doesn't exist. You will disagree with me, obviously, but I would just want to stress that we have to reintegrate studies of Russian art and visual culture to 19th century studies in general for the, as you know, better than me, are linguocentric. And it's time and space for it. That's why I completely agree with those who say that we need visual groups, and what would be especially interesting that if we can make topics for these groups which attract people not only from our field, narrow field, I mean art history. And second, maybe we have to think about institutional history, like we already had a presentation about newspapers and magazines, I would say exhibitions, art institutions, other public initiatives, which were sort of infrastructure for Russian culture. Thank you. And Margaret, once again, I support your research and we have much to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ilya. Margaret, would you like to briefly address?
Just, yeah, I just agree with Ilya that that we do. The visual world surrounds the authors who are writing. It surrounds the historians who are researching history in this period. It surrounds everyone. And so the teapots that they were using, the ceiling paintings that they might have had a chance to see, you know, the newspaper illustrations, the frontispieces of books that they chose, all of this was very, very important. One of my friends gave me a side note that I should have mentioned at work on caricature that I did for Helen to look at. But yeah, caricature was an important aspect of the visual world, and there are modes of interpretation. So I think that bringing up some caricatures like that would be interesting, as well as these different aspects.
Once again, there is a lot to share.
Yes, there's a ton to share. So we are used to seeing these distinguished paintings of Dostoevsky in our department, and you know, the paintings that we're accustomed to seeing, the canonical works of Russian high art. But there was so much more that we could explore together.
It's amazing. Yeah. Next question from Oli Ackroyd.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so basically I wanted to ask a question purely prospectively. It's really aimed at everyone. Would anyone be potentially interested in projects dealing specifically with the cross-comparative, more literary, but also possibly historical side, but from a very comparativist angle? Because what I was thinking that literature and history cannot be really studied as a separate subject limited within the borders or the limits of just one particular country, which is Russia, obviously. But for example, if we look rather broadly at how Russia is perceived through American lens, French lens, Spanish lens, and perhaps I was considering to organize a series of maybe Zoom lectures or talks or anything on that aspect of the issue. And Dostoevsky is my area because this is what I'm dealing with currently, but I would be more than happy and prepared to look at other authors as well. So if anyone has any ideas or suggestions, I would be more than delighted to collaborate.
Yeah, I mean, amazing. I think that would be really great as well. And once again, if you can draft a proposal and get it going, that would be great. I have the next question would be from Tom Roberts.
Oh, actually, Ilya, mine is a more specific question.
Oh, okay.
Send it via email, but thanks, okay. and thanks everyone. The presentations were great.
Good to see you, Tom.
Yeah, some people are also raising their hands, I think.
Okay, I'm still going through Valeria, Lera, would you, Lera Sober.
Yeah, my internet connection is a little fickle today. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. Okay. If not, I'll just. So thanks so much for organizing this, and yeah, it's just wonderful to see everybody and so inspiring to be here. I noticed a heavy emphasis on realism in the second half of the 19th century so far in people's self-presentations, and Bella, yes, and you're focusing on the second quarter, right, and the 19th century, but overall. Most speakers and kind of programming ideas had to do with Russian realism, and it's obviously not all of the 19th century. And actually, when we have this Gothic event in August, I think between Katya Bowers and me, there will be a balance of more romantic, pre-romantic emphasis and more realist coverage of the Gothic tradition. But I just would like to encourage the organizing committee to keep the balance, you know, of the different parts of the century, different movements, to have a fuller representation of this rich period. So I'm not starting a working group on romanticism. I'm actually, realism is one of my interests as well, but I just wanted, somehow was missing romanticism today, but I'm sure it will come back at some point. It's just
that's a great, oh, Anne, please.
Yeah, just in response to that, it's interesting when we talk about these questions of periodization, basically, like, you know, what's the 19th century? There are sort of people at both ends of the century who get marginalized, basically. And obviously, we don't have to, you know, we don't have to periodize according to years with 2 zeros at the end. But I think it's definitely important to think about the stretch of time it'll be, and including the earlier part of the 19th century that I think you're talking about. You know, what is the relationship between sentimentalism and later texts? Pardon?
There are lots of minor figures in the earlier part as well.
Exactly. And this fits in with our interest in minoreness, and we've been trying to, we hope, include people who work kind of straddling centuries, you know, 1819th, 1920th. So I appreciate what you're saying. And I think Bella was just raising her hand at me. Was that true?
I was just thinking that I think especially in Anglophone scholarship, the reign of Alexander I is really underrepresented. And it would be interesting to think about both kind of why that is, but also potentially to form yet another, you know, either a group, although I'm weary of forming, you know, 1,000 groups. But on the other hand, I mean, I would personally be really, really interested in getting together with people to think more seriously about, you know, the first 20, 25 years of the 19th century. So that's all.
And just to respond to Lera, you are the organizing committee, right? As Anne pointed out, there is no, not you personally, but sort of everybody is, right? That's kind of how we're hoping to conceive it.
So far, we're anarchists.
So yes.
And then I muted myself as I was trying to speak. One of the things that's coming up in the chat is maybe some kind of group for sort of underrepresented sort of areas in the field. And so maybe there's a way to sort of combine some of the things that are coming up in perhaps a broader context and group, or some kind of broader working papers in maybe, you know, underrepresented areas. But I agree that we need to do like, if you're interested in something, organize it. Because I think the whole ethos of this project has been, let's not mire ourselves in more bureaucracy and do more, you know, needless labor and all that.
Very briefly add to that.
Please.
Just as the organizer of the other 19V reading group, this is not the only reading group that can exist as part of this project, or the only reading group focused on even minor writers. You know, I think that even that is quite general. So if there's more specific interests in specific genres, types of minor writers, more, you know, a flourishing of reading groups would be, I think, a wonderful thing. There's no need to limit that.
I see some of you are raising hands, literally, visually, and I'm a little wary on calling on you because I can't. You know, there are only about 15 of you on my screen, and I'm not sure how many others of the 98 people that we have remaining still also have questions. So I'm just going to continue. I apologize. I'm just going to continue to go down the list in chats and see if there's a lot of agreement here. I think. Is my sense in the chats on the need to and the importance of organizing something on related to the marginalized disciplines fields within the 19th century. And there's a suggestion coming from John Randolph about 17 moments in the 19th century site, along with 17 moments in Soviet history site. I think that has also kind of gained some Georgi, you have a suggestion.
Yes, please, and I'll try to be very brief. Firstly, I suggested to widen the sphere with marginalized fields. Now I want to suggest how to, let's say, narrow it. I think we might be concrete, and when we speak about involving historians, maybe social historians, economic historians, whatever, what about some highlights? Something like I just drafted Orientalism and exoticism in Russian Empire, or mass media and information, or power and faith, or arts and sciences, or authorship and copyright, because I think that multi or interdisciplinary collaboration should be concentrated on something.
Mm-hmm.
That's all.
Absolutely, yeah. That sounds really great. Kirill Aspavat, I have a suggestion about the working group here.
Yes, thank you. So 2 points. First of all, in terms of organization, there are great kind of a lot of ideas, and somebody mentioned that starting 1,000 working groups. So I was thinking technically, we could kind of, one way of doing it would be having multiple keywords attached to a single project, right? Somebody is interested in lyric, like me, or romanticism, or something else. But obviously we can do, for example, read a text, which would fit many of those interests, right? So instead of 1,000 work, have some kind of a coordination where people could join and interact. So that would be one way of kind of working around the danger of constant splittering. But one way could be working group, whatever. I just wanted thinking about what are the common topics, and I'm not the first one mentioning this. This here is our institutions. Mm-hmm. So the institutions that frame the existence of what we call literature or history, and Bella mentioned the institutions of the press, and some of others have worked in different other institutions, for example, the state itself, right? Or capitalism, commerce, or serfdom, right? There's been fantastic work done on representations of serfdom in 19th century Russian literature by some of the people who are here today. So I just wanted to kind of get it out there that this is a very important aspect, a very productive, I think, topic of what we want to be discussing, how the state is imagined, how serfdom is imagined, all of that. And again, this could be a law, again, so this could be a field where we could cooperate and come up with organizational solutions to discuss those issues.
I love Kirill's suggestion of a Soyuz Sovetov. I think that's a kind of perfect model for how we should think of ourselves. I have a question from, I'm sorry, Christine Vorobets?
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry, I for some reason I'm coming across as me. I keep trying to rename myself, and then me keeps staying there. I can't get rid of it. In any case, I'd just like to go back, and there are a number of historians on this whole list. And so just to go back to Chris Ron's comments and Nadezhda Kizenko and John Randolph, it's very exciting for us to be involved. And I think I saw Faith Hillis on here, and I know I saw there are a whole bunch of us. And for us, you know, in history, we have a luxury of working in all media. And so when you talk about, you know, the thing that strikes me is that the more we can have, hear each other's voices is really quite critical, because we have a lot more flexibility as historians. And so, for example, historians talk about the long 19th century. And it can go back as far in the 18th century as you decide, and as forward into the 20th century. So it's something, it's much more elastic than some of the categories that I've heard in some of the presentations. The same is true of texts. All texts in their production, whatever type they are, including music, are culture, a form of culture. So You know, this is something that I think we can sort of help, you know, maybe free you up a little bit, and we will learn obviously from your categorizations and definitions. But I think this is a really just fabulous way of it's like being a humanities university of 19th century you know, specialists, and it's very, very exciting. So, and it's, you know, and with the 17 minutes or moments in Soviet history, I know a couple of people were asking about it. It's a project that is online. It's used in classrooms all over the place, but it's highly interdisciplinary. It focuses on the production of translations of texts, regardless if they're literary, historical, images, music, etc. But choosing, so the idea is choosing 17 moments in a period as really critical to any student's understanding of that period. And for the Soviet, it's obviously a shorter, much shorter period than the 19th century. And maybe we need more than 17, I don't know, but it's a fascinating you know, topic just to think about. And John, and I noticed a number of people put the URL to it. And it's a project that has been going on for a long time. Lou Sigelbaum and Van Geldern put it together, and Amy Nelson now is very much involved with it.
Thank you. That's great. And I mean, my sense, and I'm not sure what my other organizer colleagues, I think, would agree that culture really is the umbrella term for all of us. And I think that that's exactly how we want to address it, rather than necessarily a focus on one of the manifestations of culture. I have a question from Rosalind Blacksley.
Hello. First of all, sincere thanks from the other side of the Atlantic. This has been an extraordinary couple of hours. I feel a bit like a stalker because I've been pinning the pictures of beloved colleagues, so it's so that I can see them bigger. It's really lovely to see you all. But one of the things that strikes me is we're all very struck at the moment about what we can't do. And I think this is a brilliant initiative because it speaks to what we can do. And one of the things that I know I'm not alone in is thinking about slower ways of looking and reading, which current absence of travel and other things might inspire us to do. And I've been very thoughtful about how slower, more interdisciplinary ways of looking are really essential for 19th century scholars. And as an example, I'm thinking about the periodicals that I know so many of us will have used. And in fact, Ilya sent me an article from Iskra yesterday, which I was reading today. And I was struck by how many skills I needed to fully digest everything that was on just about a 3 or 4 page spread, not all of which I have. And which only by going back and back and back, even to the stuff in the margins, to the little adverts, to tiny little commercial squeaks coming out at the very edge of the page, that there's a kind of slow looking that I think both the times we're living in, this form of interaction through Zoom, which I think has been very successful for this, and the nature of the material we work on would be really exciting to develop. So that was just, I suppose it's a comment rather than a question. And Christine, congratulations, an excellent first foray into Zoom. Thank you.
Oh, thanks.
Great, thank you very much. I have, I mean, it's really great to see how much energy the chat is generating, and also going in all sorts of directions. I'm not seeing, if anybody is waiting to make a comment out loud, please let me know. I'm seeing sort of people speaking to each other, but I may have missed something. Anne, would you like to?
Yeah, I'll just respond briefly to to Rosalind Blakesley's comments, because I so agree that, you know, it's been an extraordinarily trying and bizarre period for many of us in the last few months. And this kind of interaction has been very sustaining for me, and the kind of slowing down of many parts of our lives, which can make possible a different kind of thinking. But for me, it's not possible to do that different kind of slow thinking completely in a vacuum, right? In a vacuum, I am just gonna watch Netflix, or you know, not think about things that are particularly interesting or productive. So what's been really great is being able to kind of check in with colleagues, hear about what they're doing, and then go back to this kind of quiet time. So thank you very much for articulating that. It's been, and I've also been struggling with figuring out why I'm doing what I'm doing in this particular moment. I mean, as I said, for the last many days, there have never not been police helicopters over my apartment. Yesterday, tens of thousands of protesters flowed past my house all day, chanting. And, you know, I joined them sometimes when I felt like it was safe, and then other times I felt like it wasn't safe because of the pandemic, and I didn't. And yet I'm working on things like the question of mещанство in 19th century Russian culture, and, you know, how taste functions in texts by Oscar Wilde. And I kind of go back and forth schizophrenically between thinking, well, I should just like, you know, do what I'm good at and think the thoughts that I've learned to think, and then communicate with my students and with my colleagues. And then I think, oh, but no, there are these things happening right outside my door, and I should somehow be connecting with those phenomena more directly, reflecting on them more directly. And that, again, it's something that's, it's really helpful to me to see people from all over the world and hear about the different conditions that people are working in. And we have people in our group who are in Singapore in lockdown. We have people really in all different kinds of situations, but weirdly facing many of the same crises. So I just wanted to be explicit about the fact that we recognize the strangeness of the moment and hope that it can be productive in some way. So that wasn't very clear, but thanks for letting me say it.
Thank you, Anne. I have a question from Elizabeth Valkenier.
Yeah. Oops, do I have to say it? Just wait here. There we go. Okay.
Now, yeah,
Oh,
I can hear you.
Do you want me to talk?
You mentioned that you have a question. Did I make a mistake?
No, I did ask. I forget the exact wording, but anyway, the sense of it was that how does the session on the Periodvizhniki that the Tretьяков Gallery in Moscow is planning for this fall, how does it reflect on Putin's cultural and other politics, and in general, the political, cultural politics in Russia, official, that is?
Elizabeth, if I may, hi, this is Ilya. We start to correspond with Polly about a session on this topic. Thank you for this great idea.
Okay.
There is much to say, believe me.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was a great topic to work on years ago.
Another question from Anastasia Loseva. Anastasia?
Yes. Hello. Hello.
Hi, we can hear you.
Yeah. And I want to say that it's wonderful to see a lot of people and a lot of researchers, and to hear all of you from the all parts of the world. And I'm art historian from Moscow, and I'm very interested in creating and organizing some group, working group on specific of Russian Orientalism. Because I think it's a very deep problem, and Russian specific of watching Orient and the Orient inside and outside, and the waves of traveling and watching. So this is a question and a suggestion maybe. Thanks.
Yeah, there seems to be enthusiasm directed towards this question. It has come up a couple of times, so I'm sure you will have collaborators in this project. I'm getting thanks. So you know, I guess I will just conclude this gathering, which was extremely exciting and productive. And please, everybody, stay in touch. Thank you so much to the speakers, and thank you for everybody who came and commented or just came, and we hope to be in touch with all of you in perpetuity.
Thank you so much.
Thank
We
you.
really appreciate it. And thank you to the Jordan Center.